Hi, my name is Dan Mumm with Berkshire Hathaway Home Services. I've been getting a lot of questions about the repair response and how to address it. So I get a lot of people that ask me about what the repair response is in a real estate transaction and how to handle it. The repair response is really the first step after a buyer and a seller agree to a price and go under contract or open escrow. A buyer will do an inspection, and then after the inspection, they'll have an opportunity to ask the seller to fix or remedy some of the items that come up. So what's really the problem with that? Well, lately we've seen a change in the market. In the last 3 or 4 years, we were in a very seller-favored market. What this meant was when buyers would do an inspection, they really had to deal with things on their own if there were any problems that came up for the most part. If sellers didn't like the response, they could just choose another offer. Lately, though, because of the little change that we've seen in the market, buyers have more negotiating power. They have more leverage and they've been bolder in their requests. So what I wanted to do today is discuss what's more reasonable, normal things that we see on these repair responses and what things you should maybe avoid as a buyer or as a seller, maybe you should counter out and not agree to when it comes to these types of responses. So the first example is a health and safety issue. This would be something like a garage door where the hinges were loose or something that would cause a threat to a child or a person living in the home. Of course, this would be a very reasonable request for a buyer and something that a seller should address. Another example is something that's not immediately obvious when it comes to looking through the house from a buyer's perspective. So if there's a leak under a kitchen sink or in a roof that a buyer couldn't really see, this of course would be a very reasonable request for a buyer, and also as a seller, something you might need to be prepared to address. Now, what's not reasonable or not normal or customary? What we don't want to see is things that are immediately obvious when walking through a house. So one example is if a buyer walks through a house and there's a missing closet door in one of the bedrooms. Well, this is something you knew when you wrote the offer and something you knew when you agreed to a price with the seller. So the best way to handle this as a buyer is to put it in your initial offer when you first purchased the home. It's very easy to get these things agreed to when you're doing your initial offer. It's more difficult if you ask later because the sellers feel like you're going back on your word sometimes. And as a seller, you have more leverage to counter these things out and not agree to them if the buyer asks for those things later. So overall, what you want to do is ask up front for things that are immediately obvious. And with things that come later that are not immediately obvious in the inspection, as a buyer, you want to ask for those things as long as they're reasonable and they might relate to the functionality of the house. That's really it. Hopefully that's helpful for you in navigating this repair response. If you have any questions at all, feel free to reach out. My contact information is below. And thank you so much for watching.